Natural Gas Connect virtual conference. And welcome to this session, PHMSA summary of TIMP Mega Rule with our speaker, Chris Hoidle from PHMSA. As a reminder, all attendees have been muted upon arrival today to reduce any background noise, and attendees do not have the ability to share video. To submit questions or comments throughout the session, please use the questions feature on the right side of your screen. Thank you in advance for remembering to be patient with technology, as there may be pauses or delays due to bandwidth. If you lose connection, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. If you accidentally close out of today's session, you can rejoin using the GoToWebinar link sent with your confirmation. Today's presentation is available in the materials section of your webinar control panel. It is now my pleasure to introduce our volunteer champion for this session, Sam Walters, to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. My name is Sam Walters. I work for CenterPoint Energy, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Chris Hoidle. Chris is currently a senior technical advisor for PHMSA's Policy and Programs Office, and he's been with the United States Department of Transportation for 30 years, 27 of those years in the Office of Pipeline Safety. And for 20 of those 30 years, he served as PHMSA's Western Region Director, where he was responsible for carrying out and administering federal pipeline safety programs for 12 states in the Western United States. And as the Western Region Director, his staff was responsible for conducting safety inspections for hazardous liquids, LNG, natural gas, and distribution pipeline facilities. They would also investigate pipeline incidents in that role. Chris has had the opportunity to work both in the DC headquarters and in the field offices in Anchorage, Alaska, and Denver, Colorado. And prior to his government service, Chris worked 8 years as a licensed consulting geotechnical engineer in Colorado, Maryland, DC, and Virginia from 1982 to 1990. He has his bachelor's in geotechnical engineering from the University of Nevada and master's of business administration from the University of Colorado. So, Chris, welcome, and thank you so much for being willing to present on this topic that we're all very so much interested in. I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Great, of course. Fantastic. Sorry about the windows behind me. If that's too much light, great. Just nice. We just so you know, I just got back into my house. We were evacuated for a couple of days. We had a large forest fire burning about a mile from my house, so just got everything put back together. But it's all good now. Thank you very much. October 1st, we got a new regulation, a new amendment to Part 192. We've been working very hard with industry, consultants, states to take the regulation and get it ready for implementation and feed information to the region, to the industry, so you can better implement the regulation. So move on here. So, like I said, I want to give you a better understanding of the rulemaking. It's a lot of information to unpack. It's a beast, and it's really just a fraction of what the original regulation was. We're going to also discuss proposed guidance, and then we're going to provide an update on our implementation efforts. Next. So in order to understand, because I saw a lot of the questions that came from SGA, in order to understand the rule, you kind of have to know where we've been and what the genesis of the rule was. What's really important when you read this regulation, there's a lot of new terms and definitions. I'll touch on the most important ones, the most important phrases or definitions that have been added to the Part 192 regulations. Just hit the highlights of the final rule. What's coming up? This is what seems most operators are interested in, is what are the near-term implementation dates. Obviously, July 1st of this year, some of those did become effective, despite the fact that there has been a stay of enforcement due to COVID-19. Tell you what we're working on, some of our inspection strategies, and what we recommend that the operators' next steps are. Then we'll go back and we'll touch upon some of the FAQs that I received from Chelsea and Sam, and discuss some of the, we'll talk verbally through some of those FAQs. Next. Next slide there, Chelsea. Rule history. This was like I said, the genesis is really important. This is what promulgated all these changes to Part 192. We had the San Bruno accident in September 2010. There was unfortunately many deaths and dozens of damaged or destroyed houses. We started working on some advisory bulletins right after that. NTSB report came out in 2011 with some recommendations, and some of those recommendations were captured by the Pipeline Safety Act in 2011. We started working on the rule. Then the Sissonville accident occurred in West Virginia, where the interstate was impacted. Another NTSB report came out with more recommendations, and a decision was made at the time to just keep adding to our original, proposed modifications to the rules. So, first you're dealing with what we call grandfather pipelines and what we knew about pipelines in the ground and pressure tests, but then they added what came into play was the Sissonville, West Virginia accident was not an HCA despite shutting down the interstate for close to a day. So NTSB recommended that we address that as well. We came out with an NPRM in April 2016. It was a very comprehensive regulation. I know so many people called it the mega rule, but it was a lot of information, but there was a lot of mandates to address. And so the NPRM came out. There was a series of GPAC meetings. I'll talk about what the results of those were, but then the final rule of part of the original NPRM. So the NPRM had lots and lots of proposed regulatory requirements. The final rule that came out last October was just a subset of those. Next slide. So what we did was we decided to split the original NPRM into 3 sections. RIN 1 is what you hear the slang. That's what was published last October, and it's mostly focused on the congressional mandates and the NTSB recommendations. RIN 2 and RIN 3 were the other parts of the original NPRM. RIN 2 is regarding repair criteria. That's the biggest issue. It's basically going to have more explicit repair criteria and timeframes. And then RIN 3 is going to be talking about gas gathering. And those regulations have already gone through the advisory committees and are moving along the regulatory process. I believe you'll see the repair criteria rule come out before the gas gathering. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight the most important parts of the final rule. They're all important, obviously, but these are the ones that, in order to start understanding anything this complicated, it's best if you focus on the most important or substantive parts of the rule. Next slide. Can you guys hear me okay, Chelsea?
Coming through loud and clear, Chris.
Fantastic. In order to understand the rule, you need to understand the new definitions and terminology that were introduced. The one that's most important, obviously, is MCAs. We've been getting a lot of questions about this. An MCA is, and the reason the MCAs are addressed is there was incidents occurring that were not in high consequence areas, and the public and Congress and NTSB wanted to start addressing those slightly lower risk areas, but we needed to define what those were. So, we needed to try to bucket up the risks, and moderate consequence areas was one way to do that. One definition of an MCA is that, hey, if it affects five or more buildings intended for occupancy, but doesn't reach that threshold of an HCA. So that's one. And the other one is addressing the Sissonville incident directly, and that is anything where the impact circles affects an interstate, other freeway, expressway, or any principal arterial roadway with 4 or more lanes. I'll come back to that more. The calculation is done similar to how we do class location calculations with a sliding mile. Next slide. Okay, well, these are definitions. I'm going to go, I don't want to waste time on this because I want to leave more time for FAQs, but these are definitions of principal arterial roadways that came out of the federal highway. Good, next slide. And I apologize for going through these. I wanted to get you guys the information, but I wanted to use the bulk of my time to answer FAQs that you guys posed. Traceable, verifiable, complete records, TBC, these are mentioned in the preamble, and having these TBC records is what we require, particularly not only for regular things done under 619A, but under the what we call the grandfather 619C. And just so you know, a lot of these slides aren't going to use the word grandfather. A lot of the slides aren't going to use, well, we're going to use the term legacy or 619C pipelines. We were told by management to stop using the term grandfather. I know it's used, but the decision was to use the term legacy or 619C pipelines. But the TBC records are defined mostly in the preamble. We refer to them in the regulations, but the definition of TBC is in the preamble. So let's go through these three. You guys can read the preamble yourself. Go next slide. Probably next 2 or 3 slides, Chelsea. So we could get through that one, next one. Okay. Engineering critical assessments. These have been done for years, but what we do, we were seeing such a variation. Some ECAs were very complete and addressed all the requirements to assess that specific type of anomaly. Other ones were less rigorous, and sometimes the ECA wasn't documented. So the key thing from this is we spelled out what we expected to see in any ECA, and the fact that we want to see documentation of ECA analysis. Next slide. So we got MCAs, ECAs, legacy pipe. We call it 619C pipe, and we all know what this is. You don't have a pressure test, or you don't have the material property records, or it's still operating over 72% of SMICE. So just want to be clear, we will try to remove the term grandfather from our jargon and start using legacy or 619C pipe. Next slide. Okay, so this is, when you're reading this regulation, I know all you have been doing this, but it's now becoming a little bit more urgent to start implementing it. Focus on 192.624, including the material verification needed for 607 and 710. So if you're just looking at this rule for the first time, focus on these 3 sections, 607, 624, and 710. These answer most of the congressional mandates that we've been getting. There's obviously been changes to IMP, launcher and receiver safety, MAOP exceedance reporting and record keeping, but the stuff that's hardest to get through are those 3 sections I have highlighted above. Next. Okay, MAOP reconfirmation. And there was a lot of questions from SG on this. Obviously it's HCAs, class 3 and 4 locations without record. HCAs class 3 and 4, those that don't have records, where you need to, they were built under 619A, you need to go back and get to get those records or reestablish TBC records for those materials. And then legacy pipelines operating over 30% of specified minimum yield strength. And there was questions from SGA. They go, why 30%? Why not 20? Well, the reality is, we all know about the leak before rupture papers that Kiefner wrote about, and, it doesn't occur to 30%. But with respect to generating the rule or issuing a rule, Congress, I believe, was the 2011 Pipeline Safety Act. They actually specified, do material testing for transmission lines over 30%. So when we wrote the regulation, we were being consistent with what the law, what the direction we got from Congress was. So, and we'll talk more about that, but right now, MAOP reconfirmation is on pipelines operating greater than 30% of SMICE. for legacy pipelines. Next. MAOP reconfirmation under 624. You have 6 different ways of doing this. Well, 5 prescriptive ways. And then you can always propose another methodology for reconfirming MAOP. Next. Yeah, and here I just I'm highlighting which are the what are the procedures for reconfirming MAOP and verifying pipeline materials. And you must have procedures for doing these key functions. You need to have a process for reconfirming MAOP. And if you're going to use a spike hydro test under 506, and the big thing is if, then you need to have a procedure for that. And what's different about this is we've debated what an adequate spike hydro test is. How long do you hold it? What SMICE do you have to take it to? This is for the first time, something prescriptive of saying this is what we expect as a minimum for a spike hydro test. And if you're not going to use it, you don't need the procedure. But I'm seeing a lot of companies wanting to have that kind of there if they do need to use it. Let's say they need to test for anomaly. Let's say they have inadequate fusion or cracks or SEC, and they want to use a spike hydro test. Instead of trying to create the thing on the fly, they like to already have this thing vetted by their engineers and by their company. And then you need to have procedures for material verifications. And also you need to have you must document and verify material properties and attributes where they're explicitly referenced in 192. For example, 624. So next. We talk about, what do you do if you don't have TBC properties? So the rule does talk about that again in 607 and 624. I know I'm going really fast, guys, but I really do want to get to your FAQs. So next slide here, Chelsea. Chelsea, next slide. Okay, if you're going to use an engineering critical assessment, you must follow 632. We also see a lot of people using this for 712 as well. And you are not restricted to using it just for 624. You're encouraged to use the same methodology in what I call non-covered segments. Next slide. All right. There was a lot of questions about assessments outside of HCAs. 192, 710. There was a lot of debate about these at the GPAC meetings. It's kind of counterintuitive because it applies to anything that's in a class. Okay, let me back up. This is not part of integrity management. Integrity management is only for HCAs. These assessments are required under the O&M portions of the regulations, and it's 192.710, and it's for those class 3 and 4 areas that are not HCAs and piggable MCAs, and we'll talk about what's considered piggable a little bit later. Piggable MCAs operating at 30% of SMICE, or at or above 30% of SMICE. So we've had a lot of questions about this. What's piggable? Why is it 30%? And I mentioned kind of earlier of why we pick 30%. It seems a little bit counterintuitive. Like, why would you require, assessments of things that can be easily assessed and not of things where there's maybe valve restrictions or bend restrictions? And we'll come back to that. But right now, assessments outside of HCAs are for class 3 and 4 locations that are not HCAs, because you're already doing that, and piggable MCAs operating at or above 30% of SMICE. And you must do the initial assessment by 2034 and then do it every 10 years thereafter. Next slide. There are some regulations as far as risk, they added seismicity explicitly to risks that need to be evaluated. Also, you know, you need to discuss, you know, how you're going to evaluate outside force damage, and we also required a consideration of seismicity when you're doing your PNM measures. Then they changed the grace period. We've been accepting this grace period at the regional level and the state level for a while, but they spelled it out here where there will be a 6-month grace period for your periodic reassessments under integrity management. Next slide. So those seismicity and the grace period, those are kind of clean. I call them cleanup regulations. We did update the IBR, some of the IBRs, particularly with respect to industry standards for ILI. You know, we expanded the assessment methods that are allowed. You know, every other time guided wave had to go through a whole separate process. A lot of people are using guided waves and casings, obviously, using guided waves where, you know, for short sections where they just, you know, I've seen people use it for like pipeline anchors on the north slope of Alaska where they're trying to go through concrete and they wanted to use guided wave because they can't get good readings with the ILI, or the ILIs couldn't be used. We also talked about different methodologies and different testing methods that can be used for in situ testing and direct examinations. It does curtail the use of direct assessment in some areas. Next slide. Okay, launcher receiver safety. This is one of the things that is required now as of last week, or yeah, you must make sure your launchers and receivers are equipped with a suitable means to relieve pressure, and that's the big thing, and are equipped with a way to indicate the pressure or prevent the opening if pressurized. Next slide. MAOP exceedance reporting. This has been around since 2011, but it's now incorporated into our regulations. I don't know if you remember back in 2011, there was an advisory bulletin after San Bruno. It was also in the Pipeline Safety Act of 2011, where it was a self-enacting requirement that was mandated by Congress. You guys have been doing it, but now it's in the regulation. It gives you a little bit more guidance on how to submit those MAOP exceedances. Next slide. Okay, record keeping requirements, what we expect to see, particularly from going on from 2020 on. You know, when you go back and reestablish your TVC records, we want to see these. We want to see these, but it's basically, if you have records, keep them. If you're gonna be building something after 2020, you want to make sure that you have this. And then with regard to material verification, and you go back and capture the attributes of the pipeline, again, you're gonna have to record these attributes. Next slide. All right, got the rule behind us. This is where the operators need to check in is, what do I need to do in the near future? Next slide here, Chelsea. Okay, this seemed far away before COVID, now it's already happened. These are what's due in the near term. You got to report pressure exceedances. You need to maintain your records for class locations. You need to begin following your IBR document, the new IBR documents. This fourth bullet is you need to start your plans for performing assessments outside of HCAs. I know your MCAs haven't been done yet, but as you develop your identify your MCAs, you need to start rolling these in. But you do need, you know, you guys should know your class 3 and 4 areas that are not HCA, so you know that. But you need to start prioritizing what assessments outside of HCAs that you plan to do over the next 14 years. Not as critical now, but as time goes on and we see that you're not making any movement towards scheduling these assessments, then it's going to become a concern for us. And then this is the most important thing is you need to be developing your procedures to address the regulations without timeframes. Okay, there was a stay, and I'm going to come back to that. This is what the rule requires, but we have stayed some of these dates. And when I say stay, you're still required to do it. We're just not going to enforce it. Next slide. All right. Next year, July 1st, 2021, this is when the more substantive things are required. You need to begin using the new incident report form. And that incident report form does have requirements to say whether or not you're in an MCA or not. The new incident report form is on the docket, but it is not posted to the PHMSA website. So come July 1st, 2021, it will be available along with the new annual report as well. But you need to begin using it next year. Okay, also next year, you need to develop and document procedures for completing your MAOP reconfirmation, July 1st, 2021. And then start beginning to implement your material properties and attribute verification under 192.607, July 1st, 2021. So not that much due this year, other than procedures for things that aren't explicitly required, and your MAOP exceedances, and start planning your 710 assessments. But next year there is a lot of stuff that is required. Next slide. It talks about retaining welder or joiner qualification records. Wait, there may be a mistake on the second bullet. The long-term receiver safety, I thought needed to be in place by this year. I'm going to come back to this, okay? I got to check this date where it says long-term receivers used after this date must meet requirements of 750. I thought it was this year. Let me verify that, okay, guys? Next slide. Okay, this was a change from some presentations that were given late last fall. Since MCAs do not need to be fully identified until July 1st, 2021, then you would not need to include them into the annual report until 2022. So you need to have procedures this year for MCA identification, have the MCAs identified by next July, and then report them in 2022. Next slide. Okay, so what are we working on? We have a team. It's a little corny, the acronym GRIT, but we have developed FAQs and answers. We have developed enforcement guidance. We developed a plan for inspector training. We have a plan for inspection implementation, which focus, it's really important that we get these FAQs out. We're running into a roadblock of getting these things pushed through and out the department. But we're going to predicate a lot of our training based on the FAQs, and that's one reason I'm here. Is if I can't get the things out in writing, I really want to convey. Like last week, I had a meeting with Inga. We've met with API. We've met with AGA. We're trying to get out the message verbally. We want to get the stuff out in writing. It's a much more bureaucratic process than what we thought. We are responding to a joint industry rulemaking petition regarding that came in December 20th, 2019. We did solicit questions you guys had about the rules. We proposed some FAQs, and then we had a public meeting It does seem like a million years ago, February 27th in Sugar Land, and we got a lot more input about other things that need to be clarified. So, we've proposed FAQs, we've had public meetings, we're just, like I say, we're trying to get the word out. Next slide. All right, so March changed everything. You know, around March 16th, we realized that the world was changing. We realized that you guys were facing some obstacles about getting your staff together, conducting field assessments, possibly working on paid launchers, receivers. There was just a lot of unknown introduced by COVID. Sorry, there's a misspelling there, COVID-19. So we decided to give you guys some flexibilities. You still need to meet the reporting requirements. You know, there was no stay of enforcement on that, but we are giving more flexibility for you guys to develop your processes, vet your processes. What I heard from a lot of operators is, hey, we're going to get them done, the procedures that are due this year, but they're probably not as good as they would have been if we could have all sat down and convened together and done our QA QC in person. So we still expect you guys to do the things that are due this year, but we will not be enforcing them until after the end of this year. Now that said, if there's a major accident and we have to go out and see whether you're in compliance, then we still have the ability to enforce, but we're not going to be actively enforcing until the end of this year. Next slide. Okay, FAQs. Let's move on. We've been getting a lot of FAQs. Next slide there, Chelsea. So we went out to industry. They weren't shy. They gave us a lot of FAQs. We went to our state and federal regulators, and then and we internally generated a lot. We read the regulation and we go, well, what does this mean? Or how do you do that? Or this doesn't sync up. And then we got some from the public. We expect the FAQs to be used by you guys to help clarify there's another typo, dang it, clarify the existing regulations, give you some guidance, and give you some information sources. We're batching the draft FAQs. Right now we were done 2 batches. We're probably going to be preparing a 3rd based on some recent requests, and they're being put into a single docket. There's the docket number, PHMSA 2019-0225. It does appear that the trades are consolidating their comments. The stuff that's mostly coming to the docket, the lion's share of the questions are coming from joint submissions by INGA, AGA, APGA, and API. So I do appreciate that, because that way it's a little bit easier to address their questions. Next slide. So what we did on January 30th, we published 44 draft FAQs. We call it batch 1. We talked about them at the February meeting in Houston on February 27th. And then we give you guys 30 days to comment further on that first batch of FAQs. And there was 44. These were the topical areas. Mostly, the topical areas seem to focus mostly on MCAs and MAOP reconfirmation. So we have that first batch, 44. I'll tell you right now, we have addressed them. We have completed our responses. We changed a lot of our responses to the first draft. They are being routed through the review process. I can talk about them verbally. I don't know how they're gonna, stand up to scrutiny by OST, but I think it's really important that you realize what's changed. We used to get these FAQs out in a very theoretically timely manner, but I guess there was some concern that the policy or guidance was tantamount to like backdoor rulemaking, that we were just, I don't know what you want to call it, rogue or being arbitrary and capricious. So starting in December, any FAQs, any advisory bulletins, anything that appears to be guidance on how we or our state partners are going to determine adequacy under the regulation must be posted to the Federal Register for comment. Then we need to consider all the comments. We actually got to summarize how we address each of the commenters on our guidance. So it's almost like a mini rulemaking. And then we have to run it back through the Secretary's office to get out the door. So those first 44, they've been answered and they're going through the review process. The second batch, go to the next slide. The second batch, they have been drafted as well, similar topical areas to batch 1. We were hoping to get those out by May. That was a pipe dream, I think. But there is, I think, another 28 questions in batch 2. And now we're continuing to get more questions coming in from various groups. But I do believe batch 1 and batch 2 will answer the lion's share of comments we've gotten from industry. That, like I said, so if we can't get the stuff out in writing, I love the opportunity like this to have our grit team talk to you guys and say where we're thinking. But you have to understand that I don't know what will survive the review process as it moves up the chain. But at least you guys, you know, as you're developing your procedures and trying to implement your procedures, we want to make sure that you're hearing a consistent message from us. Next slide. Okay, so when we were at that February 27th meeting, there was 7 CJ Osmond, you know, and some representatives from industry got up there. They said, hey, you know, you guys addressed a lot of what we wanted in batch 1, but if you can address these following 7 questions, we would really like it. So you can go to the next couple of slides and I'll show what those 7 questions are. So, oh, sorry, back up 1. You know, they wanted a little bit more clarity on sampling frequency. They wanted, you know, why do you need ultimate tensile strength? You know, why, you know, it's nowhere else is it required. We talk about that in one of our FAQs. It was unclear whether 624A1 applies to legacy pipe. We talked about that. You know, talked about, you know, if it's 624A, it wasn't clear whether or not they had to reperform MAOP reconfirmation. Next slide. Given some clarity about what's peggable. Some questions about, you know, whether or not ECDA is still, can we still use ECDA for 710? Wanted to talk about, you know, whether they still need to do remaining life calculations. Next slide. So all these are, go back, I'm sorry, go back 2 slides, I apologize. One more. Let me see. There was one other question that came in. They wanted to know about whether or not this 607, which is the material verification, could be used outside of if it could be used outside of MCAs and other covered segments under 624. Basically, could have used it in class 1 and 2 areas. So we do have a question about that in the second batch. Okay, so the only one of these questions that we're not going to be answering is they had a question about you know, anomaly evaluation, which we didn't want to answer that because the rule, remember I talked about RIN 2, which was the, you know, how to evaluate anomalies. We thought it was premature to answer a FAQ when the new regulation is going to be coming out shortly. Next slide. Okay, and this is, you guys had a lot of good questions. In order for us to make sure that we address them all and that there be a record, in SGA, I don't know whether you want to coordinate your responses. But if you guys want to post additional questions or clarification topics for us to answer, I would recommend that SGA submit it as a group, or alternatively you could submit it through INGA or AGA if you're a member that way, or APGA. So we do encourage people to submit FAQ comments or additional questions to these dockets, so that way there is a paper trail that you have requested this. I want to go back. Before we go back, I want to read one thing that came. There was another. Here's the question that Inga asked, and I talked to them last week, and some of you guys may have been on that call last week. It basically asked, can operators voluntarily apply 607 outside of HCAs, MCAs, and Class 3 and 4 areas to collect TVC records as their ongoing integrity management? Because our original draft FAQ says, no, that's not allowed by the rule. You need to use 106 in those low numbers. We're proposing, and it hasn't been approved yet, we're proposing that 192.607 be allowed without requiring a special permit to be used in lieu of 106 and 107. But so just want to let you guys know that that was one of the things that Inga was asking about. So if there's anything, you still need to use 607 sampling for covered segments where you need to do MAOP reconfirmation under 624. But we are allowing the industry to use that methodology, because our logic obviously is, hey, if it's good enough for the high risk areas, why wouldn't we allow the operators to use it in the lower risk areas of Class 1 and 2? So that is not on that slide. So just want to let you know that it is going to be in one of our FAQs that came out of batch 1. All right, next slide. Inspection strategy. How are we doing on time here, Chelsea?
We are coming up on the 30-minute mark, Chris.
All right. I know I'm really just dumping a lot of information on you. I apologize. There's just a lot to convey. Inspection strategy. I'll just give you the highlights. Next slide here. We're going to conduct some pilot inspections. We actually have 5 companies that volunteered for pilot inspections. We want to basically start testing our inspection questions, our inspection considerations, our inspection guidance. The 5 companies we have currently are discussing this with and have made a verbal commitment at this point is Boardwalk, One Other Systems for Boardwalk, Louisville Gas, Iroquois, Southern Star. We have Dominion, their system out in Utah. I'm gonna have to go back and circle back on that, because I understand there is, I think Berkshire Hathaway is, I was on vacation, but I think Berkshire Hathaway is talking about purchasing Dominion, but I don't think that'll change their commitment to the pilot, I hope. But I do need to circle back on that. So Boardwalk, Dominion in the Utah area, Louisville Gas, Iroquois, Southern Star have all signed up to be pilots. So as these unfold, I'm encouraging them to share their experiences with the industry. After that, and starting July next year, when I said the more substantive things are done, we're gonna probably have maybe 2 or 3 people in each region, or maybe 1 or 2 people from each state program. We're gonna basically we're gonna pick some of the more senior people, cede the oversight to them, and as we work out the bugs, then they can start training the rest of the inspectors. But we do not want a new inspector going out there trying to inspect such a complicated rule, for a few years at least. So we're going to have a few people identified in each state and in each federal region to conduct these what I call MAOP reconfirmation inspections. One thing that's not on this slide, so between now and next July, I have made a recommendation to Alan Mayberry, who is our head, as well as management, that, and you guys may see this, that our inspectors start focusing on, let me see if I get this right, 192.609 and 192.611, which is your class location surveys, as well as 192.619, basically applying the existing regulations. We've had a lot of turnover inspectors at the federal level, and just want to make sure that they understand how to evaluate your class location surveys and whether or not there's any subsequent MAOP, change. One of the reasons we ask that is we have been seeing a lot of class location special permit requests, which are fine. That's great. And there's actually even a class location rule that's underway. But what was disconcerting, at least as a regional director, when I had that is, why have these companies been out of, they ask for the special permit and then you find out they look like they've been out of compliance for a few years. And it usually occurred after one company purchased another. They go, ooh, we got an issue. But, that is not our job to make sure you're in compliance, but it begs the question is that if we're out there as much as we are, why didn't we possibly catch this as well? So we are, between now and next July, going to be focusing on 192.609, 611, and 619, basically implementing the final rule. So if you see a lot of the inspectors asking questions about class location surveys, we're just trying to get them ready to start implementing the new regulations. Next slide. We're going to use these pilot inspections to do these following things, but what we've told these 5 volunteers, sorry about the dogs, we've asked well, when we talked to the pilot volunteers, that we told them these are what we're going to focus on: class location, MCA, identification, material verification, particularly their procedures under 607 and their procedures under 624. So that's what we're going to be focused on. We're not going to address all the rule. We're just going to focus on those 4 topical areas. Next slide. Like I said, they're going to be federal and state. The worst thing that can happen is we decide to go one way and then the state inspectors go another. So we're going to try to, I don't want to use the word co-op, that has a bad connotation. We're going to make sure that we have similar expectations as the state people, and by inviting them onto these teams, even though they may not, like for example, Boardwalk, and let's say it's in Louisiana, they may not have they may not have a state program, but we want them to see how we're enforcing. I think somebody became unmuted, Chelsea.
We'll get that figured out. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. No worries. Okay, these pilot inspections, the key thing is no enforcement. I mean, if we see something that's horrible, we have to take action, but our intention is to conduct no enforcement with with respect to the new regulations. We will share the results, but they won't be attributable. We don't want you to say, oh my gosh, it's Boardwalk had this or Southern Star had this, but we do want to get out the word of what we're finding so you guys can tweak your programs. Next slide. And then in the out years, next 7 or 8 years, this is where we're going to be focusing. But that third bullet, I probably think is the most important to you guys is, you get this massive regulation and you go, oh my God, what are they going to ask? We're going to be encouraging the inspectors to ask those 5 topical areas after next July. Next slide. Yeah, and these, like I said, the key thing is we all got to be giving you guys a consistent message, so that's why we want to conduct these things with fed and state people as well. The enforcement will be done whoever is the lead agency, but that won't start until July of next year. Next slide. And then as we get more facility and you guys get more comfortable and it becomes more routine, then we're going to roll it into our normal integrated inspection method. But we don't expect that to happen for 7 or 8 years. So pilots in the short term, small teams for probably the first 6, 7, 8 years, And then after that, hopefully we have enough people trained that we can just roll it into the normal inspection process. Next slide. All right, so what can you do in the near term? You know, for those who haven't read the rule, read it. Yeah, it's sometimes I regret the stay. I know it was needed, but I think some of us, including myself, are procrastinators, and I'm finding out some people haven't read the rule yet. So just, you gotta sit down and read it. I hope this presentation will tell you what areas to focus on. You need to start developing procedures to carry out the regulation. You know, that's required under 605. Start aggregating your records if you haven't already done so. But I would say, in addition to pulling together everything you have about your pipelines and maintaining, basically if you have it, keep it. If you're building anything new, make sure it meets the record keeping requirements. But I envision that most people are working on their MCA analysis right now. I think, you know, I thought this was going to be a relatively easy task, but it's turning out to be a little bit harder than I thought. And I think a lot of people are adding a lot more MCAs than they thought they originally would have. A lot of pipelines are in remote areas, but they're running parallel to an interstate. You know, didn't really think about that. So, you know, people are adding mileage. Next slide. You know, basically collect the records, retain the records, particularly if you know, it's really important that you dig, you find how you establish an MAOP. You may have to go back to the previous owner, maybe they kept it, or, you know, I do know there's been a lot of, I don't want to call it dumpster diving or whatever, people just trying to find out, you know, if they still have the records. And if you have them, keep them, because, you know, you could save millions of dollars as far as going back and have to gather material verification records. You need to have the procedures to identify MCAs because they are due July 2021. Okay, and then you need to start. You need to finish your procedures for MAOP reconfirmation next July and start doing your MAOP reconfirmation at that time. Next slide. Okay, let's get to your questions. Like I said, many of them were addressed in the draft FAQs. Some of these questions that you guys pose will be addressed in quote our batch 3. But regardless, I want to get the word out. Hey, I need to confirm, Steve Nanny, are you on the line? Can you I don't know if you can unmute. I was going to let him take a couple of these questions. Steve?
I am on the line.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to answer most of the SGA questions, but I am going to punt to you when it comes to the ECA question. All right. So Chelsea, why don't you go and I only got 22 minutes, so I'm going to try to go through some of your questions here if I can.
Katie has the questions.
Okay, fantastic. Is a written plan sufficient for July 1st? And the answer is mostly. If you guys want to go back to the old FAQ1 that's posted to the docket, FAQ1, there is a list of everything that you must prepare and start beginning to follow procedures for. And it has about 20 items, but what I recommend is FAQ1. And the second part though is, okay, so you have a written plan, but the operators, you do have to remember, you do have to do your reporting for MAOP exceedances starting July 1st, and you must begin to schedule your 192.710. Those are your assessments outside of HCA's. You must start, preparing for that. So my guidance on the written plan sufficient? Yeah, mostly look at FAQ1. It has which things you need to have written plans for, but start planning your 710 assessments. Okay, does everything need to be installed this summer or do you need to have PVC records? And the answer is yes. Section, let's see, hold on, I need to get my code book here. Okay, 192.67A and 192.205. So 192.67A and 192.205A, it actually outlines the material verification requirements for pipeline components in pipe installed after July of this year. So you do, the short answer is yes, and 192.67 and 205 actually says what needs to be in those records. Also, 607F, you know, if you're already doing the, if you're already collecting material verification under the sampling program, it also talks about what you have to collect, you know, if you're lacking TVC records. Steve, I'm going to ask you for affirmation, but 192.127 though, that did come into play. You must collect and retain design records starting after this year. 192.127. You must collect and retain design records to verify that they can withstand anticipated external loads. I missed that the first time, so just go back and look at it. It's really important, particularly if you have an area that's prone to landslides, you know, slope movement, unsupported spans in rivers or ravines. You must have design records to verify that the pipeline can withstand those external loads. Is that correct, Steve? 127?
That's correct. And another item would be earthquakes, things like that.
Okay, good point.
If you're in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, where you've got longwall mining, that would be another. Yes.
Yeah. So so a lot of people, like I said, including me, when I read the rule the first time, I blew right by that part. I thought it was only for new, you know, 0.4, but you do need to collect and retain it for anything being built after July 1st. Let's see, anything else? The same applies to components. Make sure you, for components, you have to make sure per 205A. Remember I mentioned 192.205? You must retain the, you know, records for flanges, fittings, valves, extruded outlets, but only if they're over X42 materials and greater than 2 inches. So retain component material, it's X42 and over 2 inches. And 205A, you can read 205A, but you know, don't just jump to the 607 and the 700 series. Go back and make sure that you are also complying with the record keeping requirements under the construction and design standards. All right, the next question. Why no MCA if you can't pig? Seems counterintuitive. I assume it's MCA, you know, if we're talking about MCAs, yeah, it does seem counterintuitive. It's a product of the rulemaking process. Like, that's all I can say. You know, every rulemaking must have a cost benefit analysis. You know, we're trying to make headway, but yeah, it needs the MCAs. One of the requirements of what needs to be assessed is it has to be piggable. And you know, we discussed what's piggable in the preamble at length. You know, so there may be even some sections of MCAs that could pass a pig, but maybe you can't take them out of service because it's like, let's say it's a power plant or something like that, or if it's very low flow. But we expect, generally, we expect that many of the so-called piggable MCAs, I mean, you may have to take certain steps to make them piggable. You may have to get some relief, but we do expect a lot of the MCAs that can pass a pig, while it may be difficult, we think there's things that you can do, and if you can't do it, then you know you need to ask for a special permit to get some relief. But yeah, short answer is that's what the rulemaking process came up with. So I'm hearing that the mega rule is dead as it was presented in 2015. Is that true? Yeah, well, as I discussed, we don't like the term mega rule. I know you guys use it, but we don't like that term. But they did take the gas rule that was published in the April 2016 NPRM, and then they did break it up into 3 smaller, yet still substantial, even though they're smaller, it's still all substantial rules. Phase 1 is the one that we've been talking about all morning. That's the RIN 1, phase 1. It does meet the congressional mandates. And then phase 2 is going to focus on repair criteria. And then phase 3 is going to be talking about gathering. And like I said, they have gone through the public notice period and the pipeline advisory committees. Steve, is there any more pipeline advisory committee meetings on the second 2 parts of the rule, or are they done?
Phases 2 and 3 have been written. They're in the process of going through the Office of the Secretary of Transportation and through OMB to get approved. So PHMSA has written both phases.
If you were a betting man, do you still think the second phase is going to come out first?
Yes.
Okay. And they can see, and everybody has access to the GPAC notes, as well as you can go back to that 2016 NPRM, and see where the regulation existed for repair criteria. So if you're interested in what's coming out of Pike, I know guys are probably got your hands full with just this first phase, but you guys can go to the docket and you can see what's going on with that second phase of the rule.
Chris, just one other thing for everyone. We did not take anything, drop anything out of the rulemaking. All we did is, for convenience of it going through the process of being approved, break it up into 3 phases. The first phase were the mandates, in other words, the congressional and presidential mandates plus the NTSB mandates. The second phase was the integrity management type phase, and the third phase was the gas gathering.
Okay, good. Okay, the next question we had, I was a little confused about this. Why the change from 7-year baseline? Why the change from 7-year baseline from 12? I'm wondering if you guys meant 10 years, based on input from GPAC, the MCA assessments, under 710, they were revised from the original NPRM. It's now 14 years for the initial, and then every 10 years thereafter. There was various permutations. It was 15 and 20, and then the public was saying, why isn't it less? And then there was discussion like, well, how do we sync it with what we're doing for HCAs? Because a lot of these MCAs are in between HCAs, but it was just a rulemaking process. It's still 7-year reassessments for pipelines operating over 50% of SMICE. 50% of SMICE let me see. If it's over 50% of SMICE, the reassessments are 7 years. You had 10 years originally to do it. So I'm a little confused, but anyway, MCAs, the short of it is 10 years for the baseline, 14 years for the baseline, and every 10 years thereafter. Let's see if I have any other comments.
Chris, just to give a little background there, in the original rule, we had 15 and 20 years. And okay. When we took it to the committee, they wanted us to lower it. And the committee, the 10 and 14 years that's in the rule now is based upon what the committee recommended. We looked at it from a cost benefit standpoint, and it was able to make the cost benefit with some other changes we made overall to the rule. So we were able to get that through based upon the committee's. And that did include 4 or 5 members from the from the pipeline community.
Good. Repair criteria. So let's say you start doing these, I know it wasn't explicitly asked in this question, but let's say you are doing area assessments under 192.710, and you do find some anomalies. The repair criteria and the timing is going to be addressed in that quote phase 2 that we spoke about. That's under review. But in the interim, so you're not, you don't have the repair criteria that have in the integrity management thing, but you do still need to comply with 483, 192. I'm going to drop off 192. You still need to comply with 483 and 485. So if you do an MCA assessment, or you are doing an MCA assessment as part of running a pipeline that has HCAs, when you get to those anomalies in MCAs, and if you've already identified them, for now use 483 and 485. Okay, next one. PHMSA should clarify that 607 applies to steel transition. Okay, I just talked about this. Yeah, while you must do it for 624, we're fine with you using it outside of ACAs, MCAs, class 3 and 4. If you want to use it for class 1 and 2, fine. We actually support that. And you know what? One reason we support it. Let me see the code, or let me look at the code. There is a part of the code 192.712, I believe it is. You still need to evaluate anomalies, and it doesn't. 192.712 talks about general requirements for basically analysis for predicted failure pressure. And if you already have information about it, and this analysis for predicted failure pressure doesn't limit yourself to MCAs, HCAs, it could be in a class 1 or 2. If you already have that attribute data for class 1 and 2, maybe through a 607 process, it'll make your life a lot easier. So, we encourage using this sampling method, the attribute verification in 1 and 2. We encourage it, and that is different than our original FAQ that we proposed back in January. It was FAQ 16. So what you see in FAQ 16 is now been changed, and it's going to allow you guys to use 607, and I call it non-covered segments. Hey, Steve, go to the next slide there, Chelsea.
I do want to chime in there with a 7-minute warning as well, Chris. We're coming up on time.
I'm trying real hard. I'm going to let you handle, so in light of the 7 minutes, Steve, could you handle this next bullet? What do you consider to be critical elements of an ECA?
Yes, really all the elements of an ECA are critical, but the areas of the new rule that allow ECAs is 192.632 and 192.710. If you look at 192.710, you'll see that it has for cracking, it has criteria there. It also has a blank for later for PHMSA to put in criteria for denning.
Steve, you mean 712, don't you?
Yes, I wrote down 710, but I meant 712. You're correct. Okay. But anyway, what we expect you to do is to follow the criteria in there. All of them are important. And to give you an example, let's say you were using a certain model to do part of your analysis, and it did not allow you to use that particular model if the toughness of the material was less than, let's say, 15 or 10 foot-pounds, but you were using that model. The reason PHMSA laid out data to document for the life of the evaluation or the pipeline is because all of that that's spelled out is required and needed. So it's very hard to say that one piece is not critical versus another. It depends upon what you're evaluating. If you're evaluating a dent later on when we have criteria for that, it'll be this set of criteria. If it's for a crack, it'll be something else. If it should be for another item that we allow an ECA, it may have totally different criteria. So it's very hard to say. Not all of it's required. We would not have it in there as far as being elements that you need to keep if it was not a critical element.
All right, thanks, Steve. Next question, with the new rule, can a single high quality document still be considered TVC without a secondary verifiable source? And we actually addressed this in our second batch. It's going to be FAQ 63. So when it does come out, you can go straight to this. But the short answer, we wanted to answer everything yes or no, but in this one case, we answered it depends. I mean, it's kind of hard to envision, you know, where you wouldn't have a corroborating document, for your records. But what we have seen, though, on rare occasions, people have already synthesized multiple sources into one single document. So we usually want to see a corroborating evidence, but I guess if you pulled onto one single document other sources, almost like a clearinghouse or a portal, we would accept that, but it still needs to meet the requirements of 607B. Okay, and like I said, we are addressing this one explicitly in a FAQ, and if there's any follow-up questions, Chelsea, we can do that. I just want to get to these last couple. Let's see. Does an unknown pipe manufacturing date require an expanded sampling plan? Okay, for example, 1.5 mile segment of pipe with same OD, wall thickness, grade, construction year need to have 2 samples. Would this scenario require an expanded sampling plan? Yeah, it would. It would. You have an unknown population group, and you would need to have a sampling protocol just for that unknown group. So, and if it's 1.5 miles long, you would need 2. You would need 2. Now we don't, and obviously we would like them, it's not ultra prescriptive. We'd like them to be spread out through that one of those 2 samples. We don't want them within the same 50 feet. We would like them to be spread out. Next slide. We got 3 minutes. Okay. Finish it. Okay. You guys can read the question. I'll give you the short answer. Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing it solely to comply with 712 and you've done it, you're done. That's final. So yeah, the answer is yes. 710, what's the reasoning? I talked about it as congressionally mandated, so that's the short reason, I know that kind of leaves a little like a Venn diagram, your 30% is only a subset of the 20, but the rationale, it was required by Congress. And why is this section under subpart M? Again, this is, why is it on subpart M as opposed to subpart O? Well, I asked the exact same question at first, but it's because subpart O is another congressional mandate, was for high consequence areas. So they had to figure out the best place to shoehorn these new requirements. And the best place to do that was under the maintenance part of the regulations. Next slide. Let's see. Those different welding process, diesel, ERW, lap welded, that would be fine, but you would need to have a mill report or something that would verify that that's truly what you have in the ground. Also, if you could coordinate that with an ILI run to help verify, it typically can see the types, the smart pigs can kind of give you an indication of what's in the ground. This next one, the high frequency post-weld heat treated became the standard. Steve, I did not answer this question. The second question on this page, The high frequency post-weld heat treated became the standard API process in the 70s. I don't know. Steve, do you have any opinion on this next one?
Well, what they would need to do is verify if it was an ERW type well versus another. If you look at it as far as high frequency ERW versus low frequency ERW, both of them in the code have a seam factor of 1.0. So they do not have different seam factors that would make you have to derate the pressure of the pipeline. So if there's another part to this question, I don't know how to answer any more, but whether it's high frequency or low frequency, unless you're dealing with something that you need to exactly identify one versus the other, then identifying it as being ERW should be enough. If you need to find out low versus high, you would need to do a cutout of a piece of pipe that's come out of this to see what the weld diagram shows you as far as the outline, because they're different for a low frequency versus a high frequency weld.
Okay, great, thanks. Hey, I just need 30 seconds for this last question, Chelsea. Changes to the OQ program. We do expect to see changes to the OQ program. Primarily those things that you add to address sampling and attribute verification. For example, you're cutting off a casing because now all of a sudden you have a lot of pipeline that are MCAs. We expect to see a lot of stuff in and around roads, or and there's a lot of casings there. So casing removal. Some companies do not have that. Some companies. My God, my phone's listening. We expect companies that have things like casing removal as a covered task. We expect companies that, if they're taking in situ testing, if they're using certain methodologies to assess the condition of the pipe without removing it, those would be covered tasks. So yeah, look at whatever you guys do under 607, for example, to assess the materials. I would add those to your OQ program. So yeah, we do expect you guys to add new covered tasks. Some companies already had it, but you may have to go back if you're using a third-party OQ vendor. Yeah, you should be talking to them and adding those new covered tasks.
Okay, Chris, you did jump in there, but that's about all we've got for time.
I'm done.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for leading the session today. It was so informative and just a wonderful, wonderful event. So thank you so much for your time. And attendees today, please remember to complete the session evaluation, and we do hope to see you at our virtual exhibit hall and our virtual networking events. Following the close of the conference, you will receive professional development hours and a certificate emailed to you. Thank you again, and this concludes today's session.